but I do thank you both for coming, and this can be very informal, as ask questions as I'm going through it, and we can hopefully have a good dialogue. So my name is Matthew Shapiro, and this is Inclusion Above Compliance in Your Healthcare Facilities. A little bit about me really quick. I'm 26 years old, and I've started my own disability consulting company called Six Wheels Consulting. And we work with entities, hospitals, schools, nonprofits, really anyone to think about how to be more inclusive to the disability population. And some of my hobbies include, politics, hanging out with friends and family, and working on disability related work. And I started my business in December of 2014. So as we kind of go through, welcome everybody, how are you?
Thank you.
As we go through kind of today's conversation, I wanted to frame today's conversation a little bit to think about the least common denominator, specifically within the hospital and doctor's office space. If you set up your space to have me, or a person like me, person with a disability, kind of be viewed as the lowest common denominator that you can set your space up for, you're going to end up benefiting people like me and other populations of people that come into your facility to get any sort of treatment that they might require. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about how we can do that throughout this presentation. To give a little bit of like a patient profile of me, I thought this would be a unique way to kind of describe myself a little bit. I am somebody who uses a wheelchair because of cerebral palsy, and I've had to attend numerous doctor's offices and different things for a number of health challenges. I have kidney stones. I have had to have spinal fusion surgery due to scoliosis and other surgeries growing up. So I'm very familiar with having to navigate sort of the hospital and doctor's office space. And I can say, quite ironically, that they are some of the most difficult spaces to navigate as an individual with a disability, which again is kind of ironic to me because, a lot of people are going to be going in there to get health treatments and other types of things. But I have found that they are some of the most inaccessible locations that are available to individuals. And we can certainly have a dialogue as we go. And for those that keep hopping in and out, this is a very informal presentation, so if you have questions, please just shout them out and we can talk about them. To give a little bit of background on the disability community, 1 in 5 people live with disabilities in the United States. That's about 56 million Americans in this country have disabilities. You can also throw the elderly population into that group as well, which makes it even larger. And many of these people are going to have to be individuals who receive some sort of medical service as life progresses. So it's a very big population that we serve and we need to, I think about on a bit of a deeper level. But in addition to that, I think other groups that we can throw into this population, and this is not meant to just single out women. I could not find graphics that sort of related to males as well, but our society is getting larger just because of the way that things have progressed. This first image sort of describes a typical woman in the 1950s and their features, and then compares it to another woman in, I believe, 2014. And those numbers might have gone up even further since 2017. Again, here's another quick example that says, basically women have grown have gained 7.5 pounds from 1950 to 2013, which is kind of shocking if you ask me. And then here's the last one that just sort of shows the hourglass figure and the change in that. But I'm doing this to illustrate that there are going to be people not only who have disabilities, but also just people who have other ability impairments for other challenges that are going to also have to navigate a healthcare space. And so we as a society need to sort of set that space up to be more inclusive to all those populations. And then another group is thinking about the elderly. In 2012, 9.2% of the population will be over the age of 65, and then 2% of the population will be over the age of 85. And then if you fast forward that to 2050, that'll be 27 million, and then the population over the age of 65 is 20%, and the population over the age of 85 is 4%. So even those numbers are continuing to grow, and the elderly population is also going to need medical care and are going to face a lot of the same mobility challenges, access challenges, all types of things that I think if we set up our doctor's offices and hospitals better to think about being more inclusive, we're helping these populations get the treatments that they need. So ideally, what should our world look like? This is my opinion. So this is from Da Vinci, and he, as you most know, he was an inventor and creator, and he created what he called the ideal city. And in the ideal city, there weren't stairs. It was all ramps. It was all very flat environments and very easy for all to navigate. And it would not have any barriers related to it. It would just be easy access for anyone and everyone with all different types of mobility issues or other issues that might come up. And so the thing that I would say is if someone in Da Vinci's time can do this, why can't we do more of this to have sort of barrier-free environments that could be set up, and specifically hospitals and things like that. Like I said, the hospital environment is very challenging to navigate as an individual with a disability. And this sort of touches also on this concept of like the universal design approach, to where everyone has, barrier-free access to pretty much everything. So if somebody back in his time can do that, why can't we kind of progress that forward and go above and beyond sort of being ADA compliant? Because one of the things that I talk about within my consulting work is the ADA compliance is sort of the bare minimum of what's required to be accessible. And in my 26 years of life, that doesn't always meet what I need as an individual. It's not always accessible, even if somebody could say something is compliant, but I still can't use it, and it's still not very user-friendly to my needs and other people's needs that may have other disabilities and other challenges. So I think we could do better to continue to think about that universal design approach so that there are less barriers to overcome when navigating a medical space. This is one of my favorite stories. So I mentioned that I had spinal fusion surgery back in 2000, it's either 2007 or 2008. And I had just finished my surgery, and I'm somebody that does not transfer on my own for a medical procedure. So whenever I have to get like an x-ray or surgery, it's a bit of an ordeal, and I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail in a few minutes. So I had my surgery, and they were wanting to get me up and moving again, and back in my chair to just sort of see what that was like. And so the first thing they had to do was find a Hoyer lift, which I think is kind of interesting that most hospitals, they have them. either they have them but they don't know where they are, or they have them and they don't really know how to use them. So it's tricky to use those. And so a nice person came in and tried to get me transferred, and it was pretty clear that she had not been trained recently on the piece of equipment. And she gets me in the lift and gets me up, and then the thing to lower on the lift is very sensitive, so you can be dropped pretty quickly. And she dropped me, and my mom said, "This is what my eyes look like. My eyes were like popping out of my head because I had just had my surgery, and she dropped me on my tailbone." And so not only is it an access thing, but it's a training thing to better know how to interact with the disability population and know how to use the equipment that's required for when those populations come into your facilities. It's getting better, but I always, it's still, you still have your challenges every time you go into the doctor's office. And I think particularly with the disability population, people with disabilities don't like going to the doctor because they know that it's a challenge, and sometimes they might avoid going to the doctor to avoid some of these challenges I'm talking about, and some more that I will talk about in just a second. But I think that story sort of really illustrates kind of the good intention was there, but there was not enough training and awareness of how to use the equipment and make sure that it was a safe environment for me as the patient. So now I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that I face in a doctor's office setting, in an ER setting, and you're going to kind of go on a little trip with me to the doctor, as I'm calling it. So obstacles that I faced in both the ER and doctor's office facilities. The first one is kind of ironic, but in some cases, it's even getting into the building where the doctor is located. Either they don't have curb cuts, or it's in a building that might have a step to get into it. So even if I needed to get the healthcare treatment that I needed, I couldn't get into the building. So that is the first obstacle that I'm always having to sort of plan ahead and ask, is your place accessible? Do you have easy access? And in a lot of cases they do, but there are plenty of times where I've tried to go to a certain doctor and I can't get in. And so that is eliminating that potentiality of me getting that treatment that I might desperately need. The next obstacle I face is often the check-in process, because you will find counters that look a lot like this. And so somebody who is a wheelchair user or might have another mobility impairment can't necessarily use a check-in counter like this because they're at a lower, they're in a seated position and may not necessarily be able to get to the same level as where the nurse might be or something like that. In a lot of cases, the nurses and things are very flexible, but again, why not set up an environment that is barrier-free and you don't have to assume that someone will be there to help you. You can just kind of do it on your own and be independent throughout the process. Here is an example of one that's a little bit better because it is a lower table. You can see the people. The person with the disability might be able to access the space a little bit easier. It's still not 100% perfect because you might not be able to roll up to it all the way just because you run into the front of it there, but it is a lot better. The ideal scenario is kind of something like this that is very low to the ground. You have sideways or frontways action. This is obviously for a store, but this is kind of the similar approach that we would like to see in medical facilities. But you have a side approach, you have easy access, you can see everything, you can access everything when you go to check in and start the process of doing a medical procedure. Another challenge is exam rooms, and there are a couple of challenges that come with exam rooms. The first one is finding an exam room that is large enough to accommodate someone's wheelchair or other mobility device in any sort of facility. And this often leads to me and individuals with disabilities having to what feels like wait a lot longer to be seen by a doctor because they have to wait for the large room to open to allow for my wheelchair to be used. No one likes waiting in doctor's offices, to be very honest. We do it because we have to. But if the barrier is put in place that we're having to wait for one room out of however many, that does make it a little bit more burdensome, I would say. Another challenge is, using the different tables and things in the rooms, because in a lot of cases, they're not accessible to a person who uses a wheelchair. In most cases, they will do all the examinations and different things from my wheelchair or, whatever the case may be. But there might be, I can think of it like, how will I get a prostate exam? Like, I don't mean to be frank, but like that's those things that are things that I have to think about. How would a woman get a gynecological exam if needed? Because they can't necessarily access that table in order to do those things. There are alternatives where you could get a table like this and use the Hoyer lift that I sort of talked about previously to be able to get, you can roll the lift under that table, but with the previous table you couldn't really roll anything under it, so you couldn't really use it. And so, maybe having tables like this rather than the first example to allow for easier access. The other thing that I found in my research is there are movable tables that I actually don't see a lot of the movable type tables in doctor's offices. But the first one, for a good transfer height, it has to be 17 to 19 inches from the ground. And then that second one is just way too high for someone to be able to manually transfer from their chair to the table if they needed some sort of exam that would require them to get out of their chair. So it's these types of easy access things that I think we could continue to think about along the way. Additionally, when you're preparing for an exam, there are a lot of times where like you might have to get changed, or you might have to put a gown on, or you might have to do certain things. And in some environments, you can't necessarily do that. Like I'm somebody who needs full assistance to help remove a shirt or remove other clothing to do an exam. And so in some cases, you can't do that in the space. So a couple of the solutions that I've suggested is have some sort of partition. Hospitals have to do this better and have the partition type thing rather than doctor's offices, but have a partition available or also have a family restroom available, or some restroom where somebody could go in and get assistance from someone to help prepare for the exam. But it does become slightly, I guess, awkward to do that and go through that process, but have an environment that's able to accommodate that need. And then the other thing I would say is, and this goes for doctors and engineers and all the like, is just think outside of the box in terms of how you set up your spaces, in terms of a treatment option that you might offer a patient. Be flexible in how you approach different treatment options. So often, particularly with doctors and in some cases, they are very by the book and think by the scientific treatment method that is required for the patient. But that scientific treatment method might not work for that patient because of their disability or because of something else. And so just being flexible in the way the doctor approaches some sort of treatment or different things like that. Like I get a lot of treatments done from my chair, if we can. Like if I don't have to get out of my chair to do, like I've done x-rays from my chair, I've done endoscopies from my chair, because my chair moves. and tilts back and does all sorts of things. Not everyone's chair does, or not everyone's disability allows them to do that. But having that outside of the box thinking of how can I help treat Matthew or anyone else with a disability allows for that fear that I talked about a little bit earlier of people with disabilities having sort of a level of fear. It sort of does lessen it down a little bit because they know that the doctor is flexible and willing to sort of think outside of the box. And I think that can be done in the same way when we're setting up how our doctor's offices and hospitals are built and are constructed and all of that. Some obstacles that I face within just doctor's offices, and some of these are a little bit of an overlap too. The first one is, as I've touched on a little bit, is just the rooms. And so this is the perfect example of a room that I contend with when I go into a regular doctor's office. There's a lot of clutter and a lot of stuff in there. And so to then ask for me with my wide chair and I bring a little extra baggage when I go where I need to go, to get into that room is challenging. And so in a lot of cases you gotta move chairs, you gotta move all this stuff around, and it's doable, but you know, it would be so much nicer if the environment was just better set up to not have to go through that. And here's another example. I just pulled some pictures. This is, you know, what a typical kind of room looks like. And obviously you can pull the chairs out, you can do all of that stuff, but there might be a better way to lay that out, lay out the room so that there's easy access spaces, you know, just more space to navigate the room effectively. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to stop real quick and see if there's any questions at this point. All right, we can keep moving on. This is kind of what an ideal room should look like. Obviously, there's enough of a turning radius for a wheelchair to be able to turn around and navigate in the space effectively. The chairs are there and again can be removed to allow for more space. This would be the ideal setup, to where things are movable, it's a flexible space, it can be rearranged if necessary, but you just don't know what everyone's different needs might be and their mobility challenges might be.
So there's two components to that right there, if you go back to that slide.
Sure.
One is the design, right, the architectural layout of the space, but the other is an operational consideration. Right?
Sure.
Because a lot of times, I'm an architect, I do construction administration, but a lot of times we don't have input on the furniture. We don't
Sure.
have input on the exam table.
Sure.
And so the facility is making decisions that are impacting the ADA clearances.
Sure,
right?
sure. And I think that could be where, you know, there could be some better interaction between all architects and all facilities to say, okay, you know, what is the better way to set up the space? I think there's sort of the template that everyone uses, and I guess I'm sort of challenging that template a little bit to say, like, yes, I understand that there's the law and all of those things, and what I always say is, let's go above and beyond what the law requires, just that little extra oomph, so to speak, so that the environment is more inclusive and easier to navigate and have less barriers to contend with when you're going into a space. So I think there could be like more overlap and interaction between the two different types of entities. Thank you for your comment, I appreciate that. And then obstacles that I face within ER settings, whenever I have to get a procedure, like I said, I've had my back surgery and I've had other things where I've had to be put under for different procedures. Oftentimes I have to transfer, and again, either they use a Hoyer lift like this one, or they manually transfer me, and transferring is a scary process. It puts me at risk, it puts the staff at risk that are in the hospital. I remember distinctly one time I was getting an x-ray and one of the gentlemen said, who was helping me, said he could feel his back getting ready to go. And so, you know, obviously, not in doctor's offices, but in other settings, I've ended up on the floor before. Like, things happen, and I get that, and I'm not here to like call anyone out, but I am here to say, you know, could we, I guess, sort of say all hospitals have lifts, and all people know, or most people are trained in how to use those things. And would be very shocked to, with the way technology is these days, is there not an x-ray table or an exam table? I don't know, you guys are the professionals, but I would think with the way technology is these days, is there not exam tables and x-ray tables that allow for clearance underneath so that somebody could use a lift to help with the transfer process? There may or may not be, don't know. But I just, you know, I think the sort of old way of doing things sometimes doesn't allow for, like I said, the easiest access, and adds for more challenges. And then just also setting up your surgical spaces. I know there's certain ways that surgical spaces have to be set up too, but you know, again, more space, easier to navigate, and all of those things. The other challenge that I run into is in the recovery room setting. A lot of times after I've had a procedure, I'm sort of separated from my chair, which, I mean, obviously would make sense, but also there is a level of, again, you sort of have to be then transferred from the recovery room back to my chair, or you have to find my chair. There's lots of scenarios where I'm waiting a little bit longer because they have to locate my chair and all of those things. But if there is a system in place, or just a better way of thinking about medical equipment, you know, taking care of it throughout the whole process of a procedure, I think it would put people with disabilities and the elderly and people who might be considered obese at ease when, you know, when they're going through this process. It's a very stressful process getting some sort of procedure done, and it makes it a little nerve-wracking. Couple of other kind of things that could be done. I've heard of other states sort of installing these different types of lift systems so that patients could be moved easier. Personally, I don't like this full body system, just because it can be a bit challenging and burdensome and uncomfortable for the liftee, I guess you call it, throughout that process. I use something that is similar to this, that, you know, it's a sling and it goes under the legs and behind the back and is lifted up. I've heard of other states having tracks and different things in their hospitals and other things. I have never seen one in the state of Virginia that a hospital or a doctor's office has something like this in place. I've seen Hoyer lifts, and again, it's a question of whether they know how to use them, if they've been trained on them, those types of things. But I've never seen a system like this in any of the hospitals I've been. Now, I also understand that there is a cost. Obviously, everything comes with a cost. That makes sense, and so that could be one of the big factors into why things like this aren't implemented. But it's at least worth considering or taking into account. Would this make our patients safer? Would this make our staff safer? You know, would it help all the way around?
So I've installed a couple of these in various hospitals in Virginia. We did a combination lift boom in Winchester, mm-hmm. and it was one of 3 hospitals in the United States that had that specific setup.
Sure.
With a 1,000-pound capacity, because that's mm-hmm. actually a bariatric hospital. Mm-hmm. We also installed an A-trail system at Inova that's very similar. It also had a 1,000-pound capacity, and the A-trail is exposed in the room. So when you think about the trend in the market for ICUs in hospitals to look less like a hospital, more like a hotel room,
sure.
or a timeshare, when you've got a rail system like that exposed, you have infection control concerns, but you also have that perception that you immediately walk in the room, there's a sling or some sort of lift that's present. The point I wanted to make about the lifts, though, is there's a increased, I guess, sensitivity to bariatric patients. And what we're finding is it's not necessarily the capacity, it's more the having that tool available so that if you have a 4'9" nurse that's 100 pounds and she's got to lift somebody that's 250 pounds, she wants those tools available, not only for the safety of the patient, but for her as well.
And I'll be honest with you, the patient, because I've been that person, the patient would feel a heck of a lot safer as well and better. I can't tell you how many times I go into an x-ray and that exact scenario happens where somebody who is, I'm 1.5 times bigger than they are says, okay, I'm ready to move you now. And I sort of look at them, laugh, and say, yeah, okay, good luck with that. Because like I don't bear any weight, I don't do any of that. So it's always tricky to get an x-ray or to do anything where I have to get out of my chair. And so I sort of dread those things, to be very honest with you. And so if we had, and I love the way that you put that, to put the nurse at ease and have the nurse be able to have that tool at their disposal to do that. Because really, if you had that lift, that really can be a one-person job. If they're really well trained in it and they know what they're doing, that can be a one-person job. And quite honestly, I prefer that setup than being lifted. Like, I would much rather have that setup in areas than being manually lifted by people. I do both because I have to, but I feel much safer and more at ease with that type of setup. Thank you for your comment, that was awesome. And so just, again, kind of going above and beyond what's required, that's kind of my, my big thing that I do within my consulting work. Obviously I understand that the law is the law, and we want to make sure that we're following that, and that is our standard that we want to follow. But there's nothing wrong with doing that little bit extra to say, yes, we're following the law, but we're also doing this. So that is just an added bonus for the hospital or the doctor's office to go that extra mile to make sure that their patients or their staff or whomever just feels that much more at ease throughout the process. Because like I said, doctor's offices can be tricky places. So just wrapping up a little bit here, and I'd love to have a dialogue if anyone has any questions, but again, just sort of thinking deeper into how we can approach setting up our hospitals, installing some of these accommodations that I've mentioned, thinking about how patient safety and staff safety, so that the trips to the doctor's office aren't nerve-wracking experiences, particularly with people with disabilities. Because in a lot of cases, one of the things that always pops up for me is just that feeling of vulnerability, right? Because if I have to be transferred, I'm completely out of control of that situation. Like that is, I'm trusting someone else to help me get from point A to point B without there being an incident. And like, I do it all the time, not a big deal, but there is a certain level of vulnerability involved to trust that I'm not going to end up on the floor, or I'm not going to end up injured, or they're not going to end up injured, because I certainly feel bad if somebody who's helping me move ends up getting hurt. That's never my intention. That's never, it's never anyone's intention. And so just that level of vulnerability is tricky and scary and intimidating and all of the above. So if we just sort of try and think a little bit differently as to how we approach our setups of our spaces and thinking about some of these accommodations, I think everyone would benefit in the long run. Here's my contact information and my social media. I'm on Twitter and all of that stuff, and love to have updates. I do assessment. One of the things I do is assessments of spaces, not necessarily from an ADA perspective, but kind of from that common sense perspective that I've sort of been touching on a little bit. Basically, I'll go in and I'll look at a space and say, yes, technically that's ADA compliant, but it doesn't really make sense for a person with a disability. Here's why, and here's a solution that could be used to help sort of resolve that challenge. I'd be happy to come in and do assessments or come in and do trainings. I do sensitivity trainings, I do all kinds of stuff to help your staffs and your engineers and all that stuff kind of think through some of this stuff a little bit deeper if they are so interested or inclined. These were just my sources, and then just thank you guys, everyone for coming, and I'd love to answer any questions that anyone might have and see if we can start a little bit of a dialogue. So thank you very much for
I
coming.
was going to share a couple of things that I learned recently. I took a class on mitigating risk during construction administration.
Sure.
And one of the things they covered was ADA, and that everything else relative to design and construction, there's a tolerance built in. And with ADA, it is a zero tolerance policy. They acknowledge construction tolerances, but if you do 9 bathrooms or 10 bathrooms in a building and 9 comply, and that 10th one you've got an infraction, you fail. You still fail.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that, you know, they can go through a building and if they find one ADA infraction, you're dinged.
Right.
And you've mentioned it several times in this presentation that it's not code, it's law. And it's the Department of Justice that's going around, and they've started to visit hospitals
Sure.
and write fines,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I've had on a couple of projects now, there's a conflict in the building code relative to ADA, and it's with the sloped drains. And so in all of our patient rooms where we have a shower, and it's a roll-in shower, the plumbing code says you have to have a minimum slope of 2%. Well, ADA says you have a maximum cross slope of 2%.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got a max at ADA, a minimum at plumbing, so the plumbing
So
engineer says
who's the right answer?
Well, and so I actually called the Department of Justice because I had it happen on 2 hospitals, and, you know, the plumber goes in and he's following his code, and he's gonna set the drain body, and then the GC is gonna slope the floor around it, and ensure they
Sure.
got positive drainage, because everybody knows if there's ponding water,
Sure.
they're gonna get a call.
It's dangerous, yeah.
Right? And so they make it more than 2%. I flag it because now it's a tripping hazard, and you get in this argument about, well, is that on the accessible path? And it's like, well, it's a roll-in shower in a patient